Hi, everyone. My name is Helena Hahn. I'm a policy analyst in the migration program at the European Policy Center, which is an independent think tank based in Brussels. And I will today present some of the results and recommendations as part of our ongoing project on climate-related migration and displacement role for the European Union. This is likewise sort of a regional perspective, and it is more of an institutional analysis following what some of you have also presented. So maybe before starting, two disclaimers and one explanation of where this research or the idea for our research came from. First of all, in terms of terminology, I think we have weighed the pros and cons of using the term climate mobility for our research specifically. This is because, at least in policy terms, we see a prevalence of the use of climate migration, climate displacement, rather than climate mobility. And so from a communications and narrative perspective, there may actually be benefits in using migration and displacement rather than trying to change the discourse by using climate mobility, which is maybe become more and more prevalent in the academic rather than the policy spheres. At the same time, we agree that mobilities is more inclusive and I think also enables a wider conversation around the phenomenon that we're seeing. The second one is that our research is focused on the EU's external actions, but does not include a discussion around legal pathways. This was done for reasons, well, primarily due to the scope of the research, but just to say that it's not that we're disregarding it, but rather that it is such a big topic and would likely, benefit from its own paper. And the background of this research is that we found that since actually 2022, there has been renewed interest and momentum by the EU institutions, notably the European Commission, in engaging with the issue. They tend to talk about climate change, environmental degradation, and migration and displacement, so using both terms. This is mainly in relation to the Commission, less so on the side of Member States and the European Parliament. However, we tend to refer to the EU institutions in general, again, with the disclaimer that in many cases this relates to the Commission as the sort of executive arm. We focused our research on four key areas, one being impacts, the second one being the policy landscape, followed by the funding landscape, and then the EU's multilateral engagement. I'm going to start by highlighting some of the many challenges that we found in each of the section, and then go into some of the recommendations that we developed. Now, when it comes to the evidence base, some of the previous presentations already highlighted it, so I'm not going to go too much into that. But just to say that at this point in time, for a policymaking institution, the challenge is perhaps less that there is a lack of data, we'll get to that in a second, but rather there are lags when it comes to the uptake of the scientific evidence that is out there, and that is fed into the various policy areas where policy on climate, migration, and displacement is developed. So it's much more of a capacity issue rather than a lack of information per se. That said, we did find that the lack of context-specific data is a challenge for the EU, precisely because many of its development and humanitarian interventions are, of course, limited to local, to some extent, national contexts, but of course are very context-specific. And so for that reason, profound knowledge of local conditions is a prerequisite, and also highlights the need for more research funding and data collection at local and subnational levels. Two more challenges. One is that when it comes to modeling, of course, we know that quantitative models oftentimes present limitations. There's an ongoing discussion around the use of gravity models. And so for that reason, the different methodologies that are used should be assessed carefully. The EU, for its part, has recognized the importance of anticipatory approaches and foresight in policymaking, but at the same time, as is said here, it recognizes the exposure of developing countries to increasing climate-driven hazards, but it does not necessarily fully address the climate migration nexus. So we know that this is in the works. Now, Climate mobility presents a governance challenge for the European Union, just like with other bodies such as the United Nations. We know, of course, that institutions and organizations across the world have not yet found an appropriate governance setting to deal with the complexities related to climate mobility. And as we can see based on the past years, for a long time, UN bodies and processes where climate mobility discussions took place. But over the years, states have become more vocal and proactive and keen on driving the discussion. The Global Compact on Migration was mentioned beforehand, while it of course only mentions climate and migration in two of its objectives. It provides a framework for states to engage with these questions. A framework that of course didn't exist in the same manner beforehand. Now, we found that as governance structures for multilateral engagement are becoming more polycentric and complex, the entry points for regional actors such as the EU are likewise changing, and I'll get to that in a minute. Now, specifically relating to the EU, it is of course showing renewed ambition. As I mentioned, the Commission, for instance, released a staff working document that should help guide the Commission's work in the next couple of years. But some of the challenges that it will need to overcome are silo thinking, fragmentation of policies and funding, as well as weak institutional coordination. What is perhaps the main thread running through our analysis is that the EU faces perhaps the biggest challenge when it comes to policy coherence. Policy coherence is of course anchored in the EU treaties, as well as the principle policy coherence for development. But both at high policy levels, as well as at the programming level, there is lacking coherence. This is of course reflected as well in who is shaping the policy that is being implemented, but also the breadth of the programs that somehow relate to climate, migration, and displacement. At present, policy development is driven primarily by the Commission, and therefore less a result of intergovernmental pressures or cross-party pressure from the European Parliament. Maybe just to say on policy objectives, we found that the migration management approach that is oftentimes promoted by the likes of DG Home, which is in charge of migration affairs, as well as some other actors, continue to drive EU external action on migration, and therefore also risk undermining objectives in other policy areas such as development, and likewise risks failing to recognize migration as a form of adaptation. This could prove consequential in the EU's migration cooperation with African partners, where policy preferences have, of course, long stood at odds with each other. Now, with regards to the funding landscape, we found that some of the main challenges relate to aligning aid funding cycles and priorities, specifically in the humanitarian and development sector. There are ongoing knowledge gaps that in part are explained by the lack of consistent monitoring and reporting. And in addition to this, there are also challenges when it comes to the implementation of the Commission's goal to mainstream climate and migration, because as previous evaluations have shown, there's a tendency to inflate the kind of mainstreaming that is ongoing, thereby perhaps reducing the I would say the breadth of consideration that is given to climate change across the different policy areas. Finally, as mentioned beforehand, with this changing global environment, we have seen that on the one hand, there is potentially a more limited scope for the influence and impact of the EU, but at the same time, as one of the most developed forms of regionalized governance, it has considerable capabilities and reach to set priorities and drive policy discussions on the issue. Here, credibility will of course be key. Some of the opportunities for impact are the COPs, as well as its ongoing chairpersonship of the platform on disaster displacement, as well as other regional fora. Now, very briefly on the recommendations. So with regards to the impacts, we have found that there's a need to address and react to the lack of context-specific data. There also needs to be a greater focus on slow onset climate change in EU policy, and of course, dealing with the uncertainty and limitations of modeling. Second, with regards to EU policy, with a growing number of references to climate change and migration across different policy areas and documents, the EU should aim for greater policy coherence. and in doing so, also following up on its commitments as mentioned based on the treaties. In doing so, we would also reduce the risk of undesirable spillover effects and conflicting policy objectives, as mentioned, migration management and migration as adaptation. Now, with regards to its institutional governance, we found that some of the issues relating to policy coherence and the content, on the level of content, is related to the fact that at present there's only weak coordination both within the Commission but also within among all the EU institutions. And we know that climate mobility requires a whole of government approach, and for this reason we propose that the Commission create a task force that has a limited but specific mandate in order to try and bring together all the policy areas as well as harness and develop in-house expertise on the topic. It should also leverage the benefits of Team Europe, which is an approach that brings together the EU institutions, funders, as well as member states, thereby potentially also bringing more member states on board when it comes to addressing the issue of climate mobility in its external action. Very finally, the EU could also consider establishing some kind of interinstitutional exchange and potentially in the long run appointing someone such as a special advisor or an envoy who can give the topic greater visibility. We know that there are envoys that work for the EU's External Action Service, or people might also think of UNHCR's Andrew Harper, who is also tasked specifically with looking at climate change under UNHCR's mandate. There are, of course, caveats to this, but happy to discuss this in our discussion. And then on the final two slides on EU funding, there's, of course, a need to step up climate action and climate finance. Specifically for the Commission's work, there is a need to put into place an internal mechanism to map both past as well as ongoing development and humanitarian interventions related to climate mobility. At present, it is impossible to say how many there are or kind of get a good overall sense of what the EU is doing because we do not have the data. For that reason as well, the Commission should update its tracking methods and importantly also make these publicly available because this information usually is not shared in such a way. Then very finally on the multilateral engagement, on a broad, I would say in a broad sense, the EU should aim to ensure greater consistency between its internal and external policies on climate change and migration. This, for instance, in the kind of support that it provides to partner countries on adaptation versus the efforts that are being done domestically. And it should also use its convening power to build strategic alliances and partnerships, both more immediately within the context of the PDD, but also beyond. This could, for instance, involve more regional cooperation with actors such as platforms such as the Union for the Mediterranean. Very finally, the EU should also put climate mobility more prominently on the agenda of international climate discussions, including COP28, while also perhaps trying to elevate discussions on specific topics, the potential of labor mobility to address the needs of people in climate change, access to climate finance, and urban responses to climate change and immigration. Thanks very much.